Hi, all. This is Jonathan Kirk from MUS 102, Music Theory 2. Just the screencast will cover Chapter 14, which is subtitled Expanding the Tonic and Dominant Areas. And of course, we do cover that, but really we're looking at the specific context of 6/4 chords or triads and second inversion. You've studied them as just simply the second inversion of a major or minor triads, or in some cases augmented and diminished. But they have a very, very special use in tonal music. They're extremely restrictive, and so we devote a whole chapter to that. And specifically, that context in which we use them is to expand the tonic or expand the dominant, and that's exactly what they're used for. So in review, we see that 6/4 chords. We know that they're restrictive. We'll only see them in specific contexts, and they are relatively weak. And that's of course because they're built on this idea of the perfect fourth, and we consider that unstable in the discussion of tonal harmony. Mainly because the perfect fourth, although it's a consonant interval, it has a tendency to want to resolve down to a third. And so when you build a triad on that, or this, of course in this case the inversion, it will give it the quality of wanting to move somewhere and wanting to resolve to another chord. So that's what we use them for. 6/4 chords are not harmonies in their own right. They simply connect chords together. And we know them as being part of a process of resolution. And we use them to expand the tonic and dominant harmonies. And in some cases, you could think of them as expanding predominant harmonies too. But really, in this, the way that Elizabeth Marvin introduces them in Chapter 14, we'll see how they're used to connect to the tonic chord and the dominant chord. And in some cases, how they are used in predominant harmonies as well. So the 4/6/4 types that you know are the cadential 6/4, the pedal, also known as the neighboring 6/4, the passing 6/4, and the arpeggiating 6/4. I'll spend very little time on the arpeggiating 6/4, mainly because of its obviousness. But really, it's good to get a good, solid understanding and familiarity with these terms: cadential, pedal, and passing. Now, these terms refer to what these chords do. And this is the chapter that I always like to introduce that mantra that we use in music theory. A chord is what a chord does. Or in this case, the chord is how it behaves and how it moves to the next chord. So let's look at the special case of 6/4 chords. We will never, in this class, we will never use triads and second inversion unless they are used in the specific context that I'm about to go over now. They are not used unless they are in the context of a harmonic progression. So what that means is we will only see these functions being used, these Roman numerals, 1/6/4, 5/6/4, and a 4/6/4. We will rarely see, for instance, a 2/6/4 or a 3/6/4 or a 6/6/4. They do exist and they are used, but they are used as embellishments to harmonies, and we'll cover those in other classes. But they are weak chords, and we like to just talk about 6/4 chords as being these special context chords. So that's why I make such a big deal of them in this way now. Before we kind of understand how they're used, we have to understand this idea of the special context, which is motion. And we'll see that 6/4 chords are always associated with other chords. So in this case, we have two types of motion here that comes from counterpoint. One is neighboring motion, where one voice goes below or above by step a single voice. In this case, you can see neighboring motion here in the soprano. We have D, lower neighbor, and then it goes back up. So we call this a lower neighbor motion. Here's an upper neighbor motion. We have the F sharp to the G to the F sharp. And we see that there's upper neighbor motion in the bass. So the upper neighbor and then down to D again. So we call this type of movement in harmony motion. So neighboring motion. The same can be said as passing motion. And remember, both neighboring motion and passing motion move by step. It was down a step and up a step. Passing continues in the direction that was set by the passing note itself. So here, the F sharp to G to A, we see this as passing motion, specifically this note right here, G moving up to A. We also see it in the bass. So the D, E, F sharp. So this chord here connects these two together. These two harmonies, tonic, right? The only difference being their inversion, is connected by what we call passing motion. And we can see that there is neighbor motion in this, but it's primarily passing motion. So we will call this type of progression passing motion. And we can see that it does the same thing here, that this is just a prolongation of tonic. And we can use the letter N for neighbor and the letter P for passing. Now be careful with the letter N, that can be confused as Neapolitan. So what I usually tell my students to do is put an NT or just simply write neighbor if there's any confusion there. Okay, let's look at the cadential 6/4. I think all of you have a good idea of this chord. It's used so often to expand the dominant harmony, and we always hear it at the end of a phrase, or at the end of that moment of repose that we hear at the we call a cadence. Therefore, we call it the cadential 6/4. And what it is really a pair of two chords. So a 5/6/4 and a 5/3. We use this function because this chord, even though you can see the chord itself in the key of D major, is a D major triad. Now, why is this not a 1 chord? It is a 1 chord, but the context tells us something different. It's so commonly used that this chord itself loses its tonic function. It doesn't have the tonic function. It takes on the dominant function. And you can see that it's actually just a step away from our 5 chord, our A major chord right here, which then will resolve to 1. So we think of this harmony as 2 chords, and we label it as such. We label it, both of these chords, a 5, because that's the way that we would hear it. So it's a 5/6/4 to 5/3. The figure bass shows us the counterpoint, right? So we can see, in this case, this is a 6th above the bass, goes to 5, meaning it creates a 5th with the bass, and then the 4th drops down to a 3. So we see how the 6/4 chord wants to pull to a root position triad, and it resolves. These are all the different versions that you can see in your book of the cadential 6/4. So you can remember it this way, that the cadential 6/4 is a pair of chords. It's one harmony, but it's actually made up of 2 chords. The variations of the cadential 6/4 that you see here are heard in the soprano. You'll get used to this sound so quickly because it's so common in common practice music. So we have 1-7-1 in the soprano, 1-7-1 here in this the minor version, but it behaves the same way. You'll notice that 5 still goes to 1, that the leading tone still resolves up, and that in this case, D, that mi, re, mi creates neighbor motion like we saw before. The variation with the 7th chord can be seen down here. Notice that in the key of D, that the A dominant 7th chord here, G, which is the 7th of the chord, resolves down by step. The 7th of a 7th chord resolving down by step. The leading tone, C sharp, resolves up to the tonic. And re, which is part of the dominant chord, it goes down 1. So there's nothing unusual here. You'll notice that because this is a complete 5/7 chord, it moves to an incomplete tonic triad, right? There's no 5th in this chord. The 6/4 works exactly the same way that we saw up here. The only difference is that this note here, right? The A of the 6/4 chord, which is the bass, right, of the 6/4 chord, moves down to become the 7th of the 5/7 chord. So we can learn a lot from just looking at the cadential 6/4 chord right off the bat. The cadential 6/4 chord is the most common 6/4 chord that we have. And it also lays the groundwork for how all 6/4 chords are treated, right? They move to another chord, or they're connected to another chord, and they are voiced as such. The bass is always doubled. So the fifth of the chord of a 6/4 chord is always doubled. So anytime you write any 6/4 chord, you'll see that the bass is doubled. And now you can see, because of that, its strong sound of a 5 moving to 1. Let's talk about some other 6/4 chords here in terms of what we mean by expansion. Now, expansion is exactly what it seems like. It's the idea that something is kind of stretched out. In this case, in music, it just takes a little bit longer. So we can see that this harmony, from a theoretical perspective, is just a 1. It's just a tonic harmony. And it's made up of 3 chords. You can see here, in the key of B flat major, this is a 1 chord. This is a 6/4. It's a 4/6/4, right? It's an E flat, a major chord in 6/4 inversion, and it goes back to 1. But these 3 chords, we would just say, it's just an expansion of the tonic. How does that work? With an upper neighbor motion. So this is neighbor motion going up and then down. This is what I called the rainbow connection chord, because it's heard at the beginning of that piece. This specifically is what we call a pedal 6/4 or a neighboring 6/4, and that's why we use the N here for that. So you can also see that this same idea of a pedal 6/4 or a neighbor 6/4 can also work to expand the dominant area. So it works the same way. Your 5, root position 5, the voices move up by step and then back down, and it connects these 2 chords together. So I like to think of it in terms of, it just makes the dominant chord a little bit more interesting when it's moving, right? And just as this is making the tonic chord a little bit more interesting. But these should be thought nothing more than just like a little neighbor tones going up and coming back down. We label it like this. We do label it with its function 4, and here it's function 1. But, whoops, we like to put, there we go, sorry. We like to put its contextual analysis down here, because we don't really want to make too much about the function of these chords. They're really only attached to the chords that come before and after it. The other type of 6/4 chord is the passing 6/4. And I like to think of the passing 6/4 as having very specific function. In this case, the passing 6/4 is used to pass between a 1 and a 1/6. And of course, it could work in reverse. It could go from a 1/6 down to a 1. It can also be used to pass from a 4 chord to a 4/6, and this is what I meant by kind of expanding a predominant area, if you could think of it that way. And of course, that works in reverse as well. And the passing 6/4 also passes from the 4/6 to a 2/6, and I'll show you the examples of that here. But before I do, let's look at what the idea of a passing motion means and why we use 6/4 chords in passing motion. It comes from counterpoint, and one thing that composers were very fond of doing, especially in the Renaissance, was to have voices exchange notes or exchange pitches. We call these voice exchanges, and we can see that we understand a voice exchange from the context of 2 voices. In this case, the bass and the soprano. Here, notice that the bass moves from D to F sharp, and the soprano moves from F sharp to D. So D was exchanged for the soprano D here, and F sharp was exchanged for the bass F sharp right here. Does that change the harmony? No, it doesn't. It changes the chord only by inversion. So we can see that this is one way that we can actually expand the tonic area with a voice exchange. Or we can simply say we've revoiced these 2 chords. Now let's embellish this line a little bit. Here, let's add in what we call a passing tone. So here, when the F sharp moves to D, it's just going to simply move stepwise down to the D and stepwise up. And look at this. It creates a kind of symmetry here. So the voice exchange is even heard with more clarity. So the harmony has not changed at all, but I've embellished it a little bit, and we can still see that the voice exchange is here. These numbers refer to the intervals. between the bass and the soprano, in this case a tenth, which is the same as an octave and a third. The 8, meaning the octave, is right here, and then F sharp and D create a sixth. So a 10-8-6 motion. Now we can fill in these passing tones by making these triads as well. So we simply add in this voicing, and we can see that this works quite nicely. We have a 5-6-4. If we add the C sharp here, leading tone goes up, and then the falling stepwise motion, and we've maintained our voice exchange, and voila. Has the harmony changed? No, not really. The chords have changed, but we don't see this as a change of harmony because it's so fleeting. It happens so fast. The P refers to passing, and this is our passing 6-4. That's why we use this analysis down here to say that this is all a tonic harmony. Even though we're using 3 chords and we use a 5 chord, it's so fleeting that we hear it as one single harmony. The other types of passing chords that we can use work the same way. Not all passing chords can have a voice exchange, but you'll see that it's very common. So in this example here, we see that the voice exchange is between the bass and the alto. So here the C is traded for a C here, the E is traded for an E here, but look at what harmony we're expanding this time. So in this case, a 4-6 moves down to a 2-6. 4, 6, and 2, and the 2 chord and the 4 chord are both predominant harmonies. They're very similar to one another. So here we have this 1 chord that works the same way as the previous example. It's a passing 6-4, but this is still just one harmony. It's a predominant harmony, even though it's using 3 distinct triads. Now the ear doesn't hear that, right? The ear probably hears that as what we call a prolongation or an expansion. And that predominant harmony moves to 5, 5-7 chord, and then 1. So this is a perfect example of the basic phrase. And here what we did is we've spent this whole measure just on the predominant harmony. And instead of just having one single chord, we use 3 chords to create this sense of movement. So you can see passing motion, neighbor motion, passing motion, and in this case, we call this oblique motion if it stays the same. So this is an example where the 1-6-4 is used as a passing 6-4. Some other examples of the passing 6-4. Here we can see that when we are expanding our tonic harmony, we can use the 1-6-4 to go to another 4-6. So just like the to the 1 to the 6 chord, right? You're revoicing it. You can do the same with the 4 to the 4-6 chord, and that uses the 1-6-4 chord. So this is a great example of the subdominant being prolonged or being expanded. One way to practice writing a passing 6-4 is, of course, to write the 2 chords that chord is going to connect. In this case, this is in G major. We have a 4 chord that moves to its first inversion. The harmony doesn't change, right? Meaning that the function is still a 4 chord and the root is still C. So we're going to see how can we pass this chord to this chord in stepwise motion. You can see that it allows to happen with these voices that are skipping. So look for the skip of a third. We see it here in the soprano and the bass, and we're going to see a passing note here and a passing note here. So letter B shows that we've added in these passing tones. And then add in the common tone on G and the B natural neighbor tone that goes in between C. And that gives us our passing 6-4. You'll notice that this is a 1-6-4. So one way to remember 6-4 chords will either be a 1-6-4, 4-6-4, or a 5-6-4, nothing else. So it's going to be one of those chords. So you'll know that it will give you one of those chords, but we label it still a 4, and we can use P6-4 and say it's a passing 6-4. Here's a good example of another type of 6/4 chord that we have called the neighboring 6/4 or the neighbor 6/4. We also call it the pedal 6/4. And the neighbor 6/4, like I said, if you want to write the term out neighbor, that can be helpful so we don't confuse it with the Neapolitan. It's just meant to expand the tonic harmony. Let's look at an example of that. Here we see that the neighbor 6/4 and the dominant expansion here works out nicely, as we saw before. So a good practice is going to always keep these voices so that they're not jumping around and that you're preserving neighbor motion. So steps in writing a neighbor pedal 6/4 chord work very similar to the passing. So you'll notice that because it's a pedal 6/4, the goal is to connect two chords with the same voicing. So here we have a B flat major triad, another B flat major triad. We're looking for neighbor motion here. Because this chord, the 4/6/4 chord, shares a common tone, which is B flat, your neighbor motion is going to be up here, and that moves up a step, down a step, and then the F goes up a step and down a step. So that gives us a 4 chord, yes, but it's still all one tonic harmony.